is Professor of Computer Science and Sonification at the Department of Computer and Information Sciences at Northumbria University, and amongst lots of other things during his career, he has led and co-led lots of interdisciplinary research projects. They include Radical New Interdisciplinary Space for Sonification, which is Leverhulme-funded. He's got the Sonic Intangibles, which is Northumbria and Newcastle University Sonification Hub for Innovation in Sound and Meaning, and that was funded by the UKRI Cross-Council Responsive Mode, and that's ongoing. And also ongoing is Audio Universe, a toolkit of accessible resources for planetaria and astronomy communicators.
Great. So you should be able to see my slides.
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, as Dave says, I'm based at Northumbria University, which is in Newcastle upon Tyne. I've been there since 2001. And prior to that, I was at Liverpool John Moores for 12 years. And my job title is Professor of Computer Science and Sonification. I tried to ask for Professor of sorry, mine's gone blank. I was looking for something more broadly than sonification and thought about computational perceptualization, but the head of the faculty said no one would understand what that means. So I went for sonification. So let me just talk a bit about some background first. So sonification is, it was a subject of my PhD, which I studied under the supervision of Professor James Alty at Loughborough University. I did that part-time between 94 and 2000. And sonification is the use of non-speech audio to communicate data and data relations. So if you imagine something like a Geiger counter that detects ionizing radiation in the nearby environment, and the more charged particles that it detects, the louder the clicks that it makes. So it's a very direct, strong correlation proportional to the amount of radiation. So the less radiation there is, the less sound the Geiger counter makes. The more radiation there is, the more sound it makes. And it's a very visceral connection, actually, because the sound it makes, the worse the radiation gets, the more the more kind of alarming that the sound begins to feel. And we've probably all seen that in movies. Sonification takes that a step further, and rather than having this direct sort of mechanical or electronic coupling between the data and the sound, where the particles just hit a receiver, the receptor in the device, which just generates a voltage which gets turned into a sound by a speaker, sonification puts something in between, such that we measure data from some phenomenon in the real world, and then we process that data, and then we take the values of that data to control the parameters of a sound or of a tone, such as the pitch or the volume or the speed at which it repeats, or the stereo position of the sound, or the timbre of the sound in terms of how rich or how simple that sound is. And to me, I started that out as really as a computer scientist. My PhD was all about using sonification to help novice programmers debug programs by listening to the program execution path and listening out for the bugs. But it became clear to me fairly early on, no, not fairly early on, but sometime into the process, come on slide, that as well as the technological aspects, the writing of the program code in order to enable that to happen, and the linking of it to the sound generating hardware, there is a really interesting set of problems around the aesthetic dimension of sonification, because it uses the ears as the input medium for us. A lot of what we hear in the world, we tend to, without even realizing, adopt some musical listening attitudes to it, whether we want to or not. There's some really interesting studies by the psychologist Diana Deutsch, who showed how if you take a piece of speech from say a CD of recorded speech and then just listen to, say, a fragment of a sentence on loop, you start, after several listenings, you start hearing that spoken word as if it's sung, and you start hearing a melody in that. But what's really interesting there is that when you then go back and contextualize that by listening to that sentence fragment in the whole piece, so you just listen to the whole piece from the start, you will hear speech, 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 melody, speech, 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 speech. And that is also a persistent effect. So you could go back to that a few weeks later and listen to it again. And as soon as that fragment appears that you'd listened to on loop, it will jump out as a melody. And there was no intention there to adopt a musical listening approach to that audio material. It's just something in the mind-brain system does that for us. And you may have observed when you've been sitting in an environment, maybe in public toilets, where you hear the drips in the cisterns going by in neighbouring stalls. They sometimes have a rhythmic pattern to them, and you start attributing like a drum rhythm to them, that kind of thing. So there's something really interesting goes on inside our heads that tends to reach for a musical listening, even to material that hasn't been intentionally produced as musical material. And this idea is really important, I think, to understanding sonification better, because the aesthetic, the sensory perception, how well we deal with that and how well we acknowledge that can lead to sonifications that are more or less useful in terms of communicating data. So that necessarily raises issues of musicology, philosophy, even going into phenomenology, and so on. And there's also an ethical dimension to sonification too, in that when does our sonification stop being sort of this objective representation of the data, and when does it start being propaganda in order to drive home a particular viewpoint or message that we want our listeners to take away. So that led me to collaborating with a colleague at Newcastle University, Bennett Hogg, who's a composer, ethnomusicographer, and so on. And we've done some work over the years on the links between sonification and aesthetics. So that then led us, Bennett and I, to proposing this Leverhulme project that Dave mentioned earlier, the radical new interdisciplinary space for sonification, where we attempted to bring together an interdisciplinary team. There was me, there was a couple of postdocs, there was Bennett, there was someone who was a bit of a polymath, actually, was a first degree in mathematics, computer scientist, did a lot of research through design, also built experimental musical instruments, was very big on phenomenology. And then we also had someone else who had a career or a track record in his career as more in the sound arts field. And we were looking to see how understanding the aesthetic side of sonification from an interdisciplinary perspective could maybe help with the design of sonifications. We got some very useful outputs from that, but we ran into some challenges, and I'll talk about those challenges in a bit, which I think they prevented us achieving all that we had hoped to achieve from that project. Although that project itself, in those challenges, taught us a lot, which really helped us when we formulated the grant proposal for the Sonic Intangibles project. I think I must have sent an incorrect data to Dave, because it starts in 2025, not 2024. We started in February, and it will run for 2 years. And this comes out of a vision that I have for a kind of a hub in Newcastle, which would be a centre where people from all sorts of disciplinary backgrounds could come with sonification as the focal point. We could work on interesting problems that are of mutual interest. So there would be space for visiting sound artists and composers who aren't necessarily affiliated with any institution to come and spend some time working with technology, learning new skills. There would be a space there for developing grant proposals. There would be upskilling of technology, and so on and so forth. And this project is kind of a pilot study for that, because the funding for the scheme was only for 2 years. So what we've got there is a project that kind of is doing two things. One, we are building sonifications and exploring the development of sonification in very different use cases for different disciplinary stakeholders. But actually the main focus of this project is to study how to do this in an interdisciplinary way. That's really the main focus. Because sonification requires skills in computer science, some understanding of psychology, an understanding of whatever discipline you're applying it to, some understanding of sound design, and so on and so forth. It's often stated that this is an inherently interdisciplinary domain. But when you look at the published research, it tends not to be done that way. It tends to be done in a way that someone with some knowledge of those different disciplines will do something, or there'll be some cross-disciplinary input or multidisciplinary input. But in terms of the UKRI's very precise definition of interdisciplinarity, there's very little of that goes on, because their key thing, which all successful applications had to have, was evidence that the research that was being done would have reciprocal benefits to all the contributing disciplines. So not just that you would bring a statistician in to help you crunch the numbers, but that statistician would go away having learned something that would help them do their statistics research or practice. So what we're studying here is really, if you like, it's a 2-year ethnographic study of how researchers from different disciplines come together and work on shared problems that aren't even necessarily problems of their own making, but we're bringing in teams from outside who are proposing problems to us that we will then help them solve with sonification. And it's the studying of that process, how we do it, that is really what we hope to get out of the project. Yes, we will build some interesting sonifications, but that's not the main focus. The main focus is, how did we do this? What worked well? What didn't work well? And ultimately, the goal would be to try and establish some basis for how we might approach sonification as an interdiscipline, a bit like computational linguistics or something. Uses computation, it uses linguistics, and so on, but it's become a discipline in its own right in an interdisciplinary way. So that's what we're interested in. So let me just introduce the team. I think that will give you a sense of where we're coming from in terms of the various different flavors and experiences of the team. And this is purely in alphabetical order. So first of all, we've got George Beringer. George is a research associate at Newcastle University working on this project. He also worked on the Project Radical. George is a very, very accomplished sound artist, composer, working with, I guess, what some people might call electroacoustic music. So he's not writing melodies, he's writing pieces that are using really interesting sounds, combining in different ways. That's primarily George's background, and he is learning things like how to use computer programming to do this kind of thing as well. George also has very good knowledge of phenomenology and stuff like that. Then we've got Professor Carol Davenport, who's professor at Northumbria University, and she leads the NU STEM unit. That's STEM as in science, technology, engineering, and maths. And that's a unit that was set up a few years back to really explore engagement of our research at the university with school children primarily. So it's outreach to schools, and how do we get research knowledge into those areas. And part of what we're doing on the project is we are working with school children on their understanding of sound and how we might help children to develop a more nuanced understanding of how sound works. So Carol is providing input from the NU STEM side on how we can do that kind of thing. Then we've got Dr. Chris Harrison, who's a reader at Newcastle University, and he's an observational astronomer, and he has been using sonification in his work over the past couple of years. to see how it can help with understanding astronomical phenomena. Then there's Bennett Hogg, who I mentioned before. He's a senior lecturer at Newcastle in music, musicology, ethnomusicology, composition, and so forth. Got Shelley Knott, who's the research fellow at Northumbria on this project. Shelley, like George, has a very sonic arts background, but she comes from the more of the computing end of it, because she's a leading light in the live coding community. Live coding is like a live performance, musical performance, but instead of playing an instrument or twiddling knobs on a synthesizer, she writes program code in Super Collider programming language, and that is generating the music, and then she's reprogramming those scripts in real time in response to whatever stimuli she's choosing to focus on, so that the performance is algorithmic, but it's live algorithmic, and it's constantly evolving because of that. And she's got really good experience of doing that, and also outreach, teaching programming to women, girls, that kind of thing. So she's got a really interesting perspective, which really complements George's perspective on the project. Then we've got Annie Padwick, who's based in NU STEM, and she's helping us with designing the evaluation of the work we're doing in terms of the ethnography stuff, the interactions with school children, and so on. Then there's Antonio Portas, who's the main person from NU STEM who's assigned to the project, and he's helping us to design the materials that we're going into the schools with. So we're working on sonification stuff. We're going to take that into the schools, see how children interact with sonification, to see how their experience can affect the way we might design sonifications for more general use, and what sort of things we maybe need to think about in the school curriculum to help children have a much richer, nuanced, well-developed understanding of sound, rather than just sound is music. Dr. Jan Ratcliffe is a lecturer at Northumbria University. He's a mathematician, and he studies waves. He used to study ocean waves, but now he's studying space waves in terms of the wave-like movements in the charged particles of the Earth's magnetosphere, and the effect that solar wind and other space weather has on that. And he started exploring how to use sonification to reveal things in the data that aren't traditionally revealed by visualizations of the data. Then we've got Rose. Rose Shepherd is a PhD student working. She's on the Newcastle Northumbria NU Data CDT, and she's doing a PhD in astronomy or astrophysics, supervised by Chris Harrison and myself, and she's using sonification for the classification of galactic spectra. And then there's me. That was me taken, a picture of me taken at a performance we did on the Radical project, a live improvisation. I'm the project lead for the project. Then we've got Lucy Wally. Lucy is a material scientist at Northumbria. She studies the vibrations at the quantum level of crystalline structures with a view to developing new materials, and she started using sonification to kind of visualize those vibrations. And I think that's the team. Yeah. So that's the team we've got, very broad. What's that led to? So here's some reflections I've got from some of that work at the interdisciplinary barriers. But first of all, something that comes up a lot, you see it a lot in the literature, and we've observed this in our own work, is the issue of language. There's some really interesting work published, I think it's Ackerman and Baker and others, that talk about interdisciplinary work in a similar way to the way that trade used to work in the pre-industrial era. And it's a phenomenon of boundary crossing. So you'd have someone go to a new country, there's no common language. How do they cross that boundary to come to develop useful trade with that other culture, that other civilization, of mutual benefit to both? And what you find is that new languages start forming. You get pidgins forming around the needs of the trade itself, and then those pidgins can develop into more sophisticated creoles. So there's this idea of shared languages being developed by the two communities in order to achieve goals of mutual benefit. And we found within our interdisciplinary context that even our common shared language of English is often really not a common shared language when it comes down to specific terms. Jargon words, keywords in a particular field have very precise and often different meanings from the same English word in a different context. We come up against this almost every week in our team meetings. And it's a really interesting challenge to see how we navigate that to make sure that we are not talking across each other. Another problem that's come up is this concept of worldviews, or Weltanschauungen, where you will come into an interdisciplinary engagement with your own set of disciplinary norms. I've called these rigid ways of knowing and evaluating. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but just we even know from, say, ref purposes that in a computer science ref submission, what's counted as being of value to the ref is quite different from what would be counted as valuable to the ref in, say, an arts and humanities thing. So someone in the humanities, a book chapter might be a very valued contribution for ref purposes. All the book chapters I've written, you can just throw them out. They're of no relevance to the unit of assessment that I'm in. So that way of understanding how knowledge is constructed and evaluated and the valid ways of knowing can be quite fixed and rigid, and then you hit up against, or let's say you are exposed to other ways of understanding the world, other ways of knowing, and that can be quite startling at times. You know, when someone in music starts talking about epistemologies and ways of knowing the world through developing art to help us interact with the world, whereas your more traditionally trained scientist thinks about well-designed studies where every variable is controlled for, and you're analyzing the data statistically to see what is likely to be the cause of the phenomenon we're observing. And their way of knowing is a very different way of knowing. But once you can appreciate that there are different ways of knowing and being and existing and thinking about the world, that can lead to interesting insights for all the contributors in that. But it's finding supportive ways of allowing those conversations to take place in non-challenging, non-threatening ways, where people can even say, well, I think that's bollocks, which does happen from time to time, but without any offense being taken, because sometimes you just need to say that and say why you think that's rubbish, and then you can have it explained to you why maybe it's not rubbish. Maybe it might be rubbish in your context, but maybe you could think about looking at the world in this other way as well, to add a further layer of value and insight into the data you've got, maybe to contextualize it, nuance it, and so on. Another thing I found is you can easily get a lack of buy-in. If the whole process isn't managed and curated well, what I observed happening is sometimes people with a certain interest will only be interested in the project insofar as it directly relates to what they're interested in, and they weren't interested in picking up other stuff. And that can be very frustrating as a project lead, when you think you brought together the dream team, and then some of that dream team is only interested in their little niche, and as soon as the work goes beyond something that they can't see as having direct relevance to them, they kind of stop coming to meetings, and that can really hamper the outcomes you're looking to achieve. So what were some of the ideas that we came up with to maybe help to prevent some of those challenges stopping us from making progress with the Sonic Intangibles project, we have been very, very diligent to have regular fortnightly all-team meetings where everybody comes, and whatever's on the agenda we all discuss and take part in. We also have some social events, and we're about building up a team identity rather than an individual identity who's doing a bit of work on this project. We're all part of this project. And so far, I've been really excited by the team because I'm getting really excellent I'm getting really excellent buy-in. I'm observing really excellent buy-in from team members who are really excited about the work we're doing, and they're taking leadership and ownership of their sub-tracks, their little work packages, but not in an exclusive manner. No one's taking stuff, going away and saying, I'll see you in 6 months when I've done this. We're involving everybody. So it's really great. And this is helping to lead to a strong team identity and joint ownership of the work. So here's some of the things we are doing on the project, concrete examples of things that we think may be really helpful to fostering this interdisciplinary identity. Later this month, we are having a shared values mapping session. Shelley proposed this, and in her words, it was to map the values, boundaries and assumptions that we're all bringing to the project, to bring awareness to and develop an understanding of where there are potential crossovers and conflicts in our ways of thinking and working. And that's also been something that's been missing in collaborative work that hasn't gone so well in Shelley's experience. So we're bringing in an external facilitator to run that session for us. So none of the team has to try and run that session, which can lead to all sorts of interesting dynamics in terms of agenda setting and so forth. So this is about, in part, addressing that language, those language barriers, but it's also about helping us to understand each other better and know the way that we think, what makes us tick, what values we hold that drive the way that we do things. Because what's important to me won't necessarily be important to someone else. And it's really helpful to understand those underlying motivations to be able to interpret what that person is saying when they're contributing to meetings and coming up with ideas that they think we should do. If we know that that is motivated by this set of values or this agenda that this person holds, it's much easier to make a really informed decision about whether that is something we should be doing on the project or not. And it helps to avoid us falling back into, well, I just think that's rubbish kind of ways of thinking. Another thing that's underpinning the project all the way through is ethnographic reflection. We built it in from the start of the project, and Carol in the NU STEM unit has provided us with a reflective diary template, which after everything that we do, every meeting or session that we have, we all individually fill in our own reflective diary where we're talking about, excuse me, who and what was there. There's a so what question, you know, what did I get from this, and what might happen in the future, the now what question. And this enables us to identify anything we found really useful or valuable about a session, or anything that we found problematic, you know, the so what question, why is this relevant? And then we come back and we discuss these things later on. And this is providing a lot of the documentation that will be used for doing an ethnographic analysis of the project team working, which will help us toward that goal of understanding how we could do this kind of work in an interdisciplinary manner. We've got a regular reading group where each person suggests articles that they have found very interesting from their own practice, and we read them in advance and then we discuss them in the group. And it's really helpful for understanding the way people think, you know, that it might be a very experimental piece of work in a scientific way, or it might be a very artistic piece of work in a sort of reflective kind of way. And because this person found it interesting and valuable, we all need to approach it as if this is an interesting and valuable paper. Whereas if we've just been given it in the past to read, we might go, well, I don't get it. Please explain this to me. So it's in that where we see the value that people attribute to papers and articles and ways of thinking. Again, we help to have our horizons expanded a bit to understand the different ways that people think about the world and the problems in the world. We're also getting group buy-in. We are in the process of recruiting external teams or groups that want help in using sonification to solve a problem in their domain. And then we, as the team, we're going to select 2 or 3 of the ones that we think are going to help us achieve what we want on the project. And then we're going to work with those teams as a group to help them develop that sonification. So this is contributed to by all the team members, and this work will be documented ethnographically as well. So this is going to help to avoid that situation where someone opts out of a piece of work because it's not of interest to them. Okay. And then we've got a set of skill sharing sessions. We know that each team member has practices and skills and knowledge that other team members don't have. So we've started running sessions where, say, the other week, Lucy did a session on how to use Git and GitHub to manage software development and also the website for the project. And team members who have no knowledge of that came up and learned some of the basics. They're not Git experts by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a way of helping us to share the skills and the knowledge that we have so that other people in the team can take some of that and then maybe use that in their own practice. So there will be more of those coming up. There'll be some programming ones, there'll be some work on maybe sound design or whatever. And then the last thing I want to say is this idea of imposter syndrome. This again is one of the challenges I've observed, and our team has been very honest and vocal about sharing their own experiences with this. It's very easy in a team meeting where you're talking about a problem and then you hear other people around the table talking about ways they would solve that problem or work they've done, and you think, oh, that's really amazing. I feel so inadequate because I'm surrounded by giants and these people all seem to know so much more than me. But when you go around the table, they all seem to say the same thing. And I think this is one of the things that can cause people to maybe drift away a bit because they don't feel they're making a valuable contribution to the project because everyone else seems to know so much more than they do. But that's partly because they are expert in a particular thing that you are not. So when they talk about that thing, the only experience you have of that thing is what they present. They sound knowledgeable, so you think, oh gosh, they sound really good. Whereas as an individual, you know all the stuff you don't know, even about your own discipline. So it's very easy, especially in academia, I think, for people to feel inadequate in that kind of high stakes melting pot of big brains working on a project that only has 2 years to finish, and you think, oh, what am I bringing to the party? And it's really useful, we found, to share that and then actually to have mutual encouragement where people actually say what they value about the other person. These aren't therapy sessions, I should say, but it's saying, well, when you did that, Paul, that really helped me to understand something in a new light. And you go, oh, okay, that's good, thank you. But then likewise, you do that with the other people. So I'm aware of how much or how little time we had. So I think that's run up right to the deadline of how much time Dave said we should have. So I'll leave it there because I'm aware that this is supposed to be a conversation as well, and I'm happy to take any questions that people might have.
Thanks, Paul. That was fantastic. Lots of stuff to digest there, and lots of stuff I'm sure will be familiar to people working in interdisciplinary spaces. I've got questions, but I do like to throw to the audience first before I kind of dive in. But maybe whilst people are, does anyone want to raise their hand? Because we don't have any questions in the chat as yet, but I'll give people a chance to raise their hand. Poppy. And then, sorry.
Really interesting, Paul. Thank you so much for sharing that. It was
Pleasure.
Absolutely fantastic to see all of those different sort of techniques that you've got to help build that sort of interdisciplinary team. And I'm wondering how much those are all brought by different people from their different disciplines, how much that's been very intentional or how much that's arisen organically. Because I think the one that particularly struck me was the values. You mentioned that, and that you've got that session coming up, but it almost felt like actually that was almost the basis of everything, that if we understand each other's values, we can build on top of that. So it slightly threw me that you've not done that yet, actually. So I'm not sure if that's a comment, a question, or a bit of both.
It's when we wrote the grant application, most of the things you saw on that list were things that we had articulated we would do in the grant as part of the grant. And one of the first things we said we would do was this work around language, understanding. So we've already been doing some of that, but it became clear very quickly that a formalized session with an external speaker would maybe help us to achieve more faster than if we tried to negotiate it all by ourselves. So yeah, it's maybe coming slightly later, but it wasn't until, so it's happening in June, but of course this was thought about in March, but it takes time to plan and book dates and things. Yeah, we started on the 1st of February. That's when the project started. Of course, the first month of the project is meet and greet, really. So I get your reservation about this looks to be coming a bit late, but I think it's coming at the point at which we now know we can make real use of this before we do any of the real serious development work. Because at the moment, the first stage of the project has really been about planning what we're going to do for the second 18 months of the project. We had the overall goals, but as you know, the overall work plans then need fleshing out into real detailed things about what we're going to do, who we're going to do it with. But part of that is about recruiting people to do it with. And it's not until we've spent a few weeks or a month or so really getting to know each other as individuals that we begin to realize the best way of doing these things. So the project plan had been to have sessions around language and understanding, but it became clear that that wasn't necessarily going to be the most effective way of doing that. And maybe we need this single session, half-day session with an external speaker facilitator to help us do that. Someone who's got experience in running that sort of session. So
thank you.
Yeah, all the really obvious things.
Judgmental.
No, I really don't mind. I don't mind, and you're right that it sounds like something that should happen at the start, and sometimes the things that should happen at the start you only realize should have happened at the start once you've understood the problem you're working with. And then for the next grant, this thing will happen at the start. You're always learning, aren't you?
Thank you.
Cool. Maria's hand was up next.
Hello, thank you, Paul. This was fascinating. Just to say, I had to drop out at some point to go to an exam board meeting, so maybe I've missed something in relation to what I want to ask. So apologies if this was the case. I found the last bit of your presentation very, very useful, and especially the way you talked about having a meaningful buy-in from collaborators, because that's something I have come up against. I work with sound and movement interaction from a kind of performance and participatory research. And one thing I'm interested is, especially in relation to your subject matter, which I think has an embodied and kind of kinesthetic proprioceptive dimension, whether all those ways you described at the end, those ways of coming together, creating a shared epistemological space, involves other means apart from talking and sitting. Or maybe perhaps you're not just talking and sitting, but the way you described all of that, I almost felt there was an assumption that all these people are just sitting around the table. So I just wonder whether you thought at all about other ways of being together and other ways of engaging your perceptual systems as researchers on this project.
Yeah, it's a really good question, some good insight. Up till now, a lot of it has been sitting around a table because we've just been planning stuff. and working out what we can actually do in the time that we've got with the resources we have. But last week before last, the team we had a whole evening doing a Pint of Science event. So we had that was open to the public, of course, and I gave a quick overview of what sonification was, and then different members of the team gave examples from their own practice of the kind of work they do. So Lucy gave some examples of how she used sonification to help identify different crystalline structures. The difference between different minerals and the way that they sound really gives you some insight into the molecular bondings. Dan gave some examples of space weather and the Whistler chorus waves that you get in the upper atmosphere and in the magnetosphere. But then Shelley did a live coding performance of 18 months of data from her garden, which she had sensors in her back garden, and she'd been collecting data and then used that to produce this musical performance piece that she was also interacting with through changing the code. And George gave a performance which he calls Steps Twice in Still Waters, which is a performance he gives, which, if you're familiar with the old Alvin Lucia piece from the 1950s, it's a bit of a homage to that in a sense. He has a multi-channel EEG that he wears on his head, and then that is driving the generation of tones and sounds in real time. So he was literally sitting there still, and we're listening in some way to the way his mind is, or his brain, let's say the electrical activity of his brain is happening in real time, and how he's responding to stimuli. And this kind of activity, which you're right, is really helping to give the team a much deeper understanding of the ways of thinking about and approaching the world. And we're also working on an installation with a related project where we're taking the data from the coronal mass ejection from May last year, which led to us being able to see the aurora ways further south than we should be. And we're turning that into a sound installation that George has done the composition for, which is a sonification of that data. And so it's going to be a very immersive, embodied experience. And the team, we're also going to do a session for the team where we experience that kind of thing. So yeah, we are exposing the whole of the team to these kinds of things as well, so we get a much deeper appreciation of the different ways of being and interacting with the world than we would get just from sitting around the table and talking about it.
Great, thank you. I think there is something there about the aesthetics of interdisciplinarity, isn't it?
Oh wow, that's a whole meta level I hadn't thought about.
I'm thinking about, in relation to your research, how you moved from the computization of sound to the aesthetics of sound. And perhaps there's something about the aesthetics of interdisciplinarity as a way of creating those shared social and epistemological spaces.
I like that. I'll make a note of that. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got some questions now in the chat. A lot of questions, so we'll see if we can get through them all before 12. So I think you might have touched on this actually just there, but Iana asks, does it matter if you're holding meetings face to face or virtually? Do you find any difference in that? I don't suppose in terms of engagement or...
Yeah, on the Radical project, which we started in 2021, so we were in the middle of one of the lockdowns that we had. The first 6 or 8 months of that project were all online, and it was difficult. It really was difficult. We tried to do quite a bit, but the advantage we have on the Sonic Intangibles project, I mean, we should have had it with Radical as well, because it's just the two universities working together again, is that all the investigators are local to Newcastle, the whole project team, and the research fellows are based locally, so we have all our meetings in person. And I think that makes a huge difference. It's a much more natural way of interacting and being with people. you can interrupt people in the way that you can't online, which brings its own challenges as well, but needs a good chairing the meeting in that case.
Did you agree
And,
did you agree on that, like as a group beforehand, to say, right, we're going to do it, or was there kind of like a...
It was as we were developing the application, the full application, it was kind of a rule of the project where everyone would come to everything as a default, and then obviously there would be things that people couldn't get to, or there really was no need for them to go to that thing. But by and large, that was the default working position, that we would all be at the meetings.
Okay, cool. Second part of Jana's question, how does project logic apply? Are some people more involved at the start or toward the end? Or
no, it's everyone in it right from the beginning, full on, wholeheartedly. Yeah.
Right.
The way it was costed was everyone's doing the full 2 years on the project.
From Ines, Ines loves the ethnographic approaches, especially the diary. Ines wonders how people found the diary, especially those less used to those kind of things.
Yeah,
how you fed back as a group.
I was really impressed at how open everyone was to doing that. Yeah. There hasn't been any pushback. Which
and have people
really
done
nice
it?
surprise.
How do you know that people have done it?
Because we're very honest. We say whether we've done it or not. We're very honest about, well, I haven't read the paper for this reading group meeting this week, or I haven't, or I'll confess I haven't done the diary for this week. Sorry. And it's, we're not policing it in that way. You don't have to hand in your homework and have it marked. But we understand the value of why we're doing that, because that is providing a lot of the raw data that we're going to need for documenting and analyzing how people approach the work. Yeah.
Yeah. I was just saying, it sounds like you really invested in developing trust and understanding within the group.
Yeah.
And you sound like you're really comfortable with each other, the way you talk about it.
It really helps that we didn't just pull the group together by saying, oh, I know of so-and-so who's doing this work. Would they like to be involved with the project? It was based on existing networks. So it's people I'd already either worked with in the past or had started developing a relationship with through conversations. Those were the people that we brought into the project.
Okay.
So it was people who were already excited by the idea of the project, and through working on the development of the grant application, I knew I could trust.
Yeah.
You could see really early on whether someone was buying into it or not by what they were contributing to that process. And so, yeah, I think that's a real key to it, is pick your project partners really carefully.
Yeah.
It's harder when it's cross institution. It's even harder when it's geographically distributed as well. We're very fortunate in that the two universities are 5 minutes walk from each other. In fact, there's colleagues in Newcastle whose office is closer to mine than colleagues at Northumbria.
Okay. We've got a couple of last questions. So got a question from Paula. Could you please offer reflection, how much time you dedicate as a PI to manage all the activities of an interdisciplinary team, and how much your co-Is have to dedicate to the project?
If you look at the costings that we submitted, I'm 0.2 FTE, and the co-leads, I think, are 0.1.
Okay.
0.005, 0.1. And is it all that time really considered in the FTE? I mean, it never is it? It never is. However, we do have to fill in time cards, I think, for UKRI, which is only discovered like last month.
Okay.
So no, but what happens is what happens when academics get interested and invested in something. They tend to do more than is required for it, and will make it work. if they lose interest in it, then you find they don't contribute. Has there ever been a research project where the time you spent on it has actually matched the costing model? I doubt it. It's just we get the costs in, UKRI pays us, and then we just work on our research in a flexible way that we always do with everything else that we do. It just becomes rolled into part of one bigger job, doesn't it?
Yeah. Okay, one last final question from Daniel. I'm going to rephrase it a little bit, Daniel, so we can do it quickly. But if Daniel says, what does it need? What's most important to get interdisciplinary project funded in the first place? So what if you could name one thing, Paul, what would you say is the most important thing to get an interdisciplinary project funded? Tough question.
It depends who's funding it.
Let's say it's UKRI. Let's say it's UKRI, cross-council responsive mode.
Well, if it's UKRI, it's very simple. You have to demonstrate the reciprocal benefit of the research to the contributing disciplines. That was the key that separated those that got shortlisted from those that didn't. So you had to make it really clear that your material scientist, your astronomer, your computer scientist, your musician, your mathematician coming together on this would be taking something back out of the project that they could apply to their own practice. Not just that they were feeding knowledge in and generating some nice papers or whatever, but that what they learned on the project would materially influence and affect the way they then go back and think about their own work.
Yeah.
If you're not doing that, UKRI wouldn't fund it under this scheme.
Okay. I think there could be a whole insight series reflecting on that. Okay, but with that, we'll come to an end. It's 12 o'clock. Thank you ever so much, Paul. That was a fantastic talk and a really productive question and answer session. Thank you to everybody that has come along.